My name is Dr. Mona Sobhani. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and I am the least likely person to tell the story of spiritual transformation, and here's why. I was a traditionally trained cognitive neuroscientist. I was a scientific materialist, which is the philosophy and worldview that the reality is composed of just physical matter. And that's what they train us to believe in neuroscience graduate school. And because of that, I was also taught that the universe has no external meaning, that everything is random, meaningless, that all meaning is created by our brains. Our brains are coincidence detectors, so they look for coincidences. We create meaning and we tell stories with our brains. So everything is very random, and you come to, this is the indoctrination that we receive in graduate school. We all come to believe it without understanding that there are other philosophies and worldviews that also describe reality. So growing up, I was never very spiritual or religious, and especially after I finished my training in graduate school, I was a bit anti-spiritual and anti-religious and thought that it was just a coping mechanism for humans to make it through life, which is difficult and which is a lot of suffering. And that seems to be a very common view and belief amongst scientists. So that's what I adopted, and I just never needed it as a coping mechanism, so I didn't have a lot of respect for it. So my culture is Persian. I have a Persian cultural heritage. We are Zoroastrian indigenously, which means we have a lot of mystical traditions and rituals that run through our culture. And my grandmother and my mother both read coffee grinds, which is a form of divination. It's just a way for a person to use a medium and intuit things about another person's past, present, and future. So my grandmother was very well trained in this, and she taught my mother, who would do it for all of our family and friends at our family events, and I ignored it. I didn't understand it until I started going home on the weekends during graduate school, and my mother would read for me, and I started noticing that the things that she said would come true, sometimes months in advance, and they would be things that would be very specific to my life, very private, intimate things that I would never tell anybody, and she would know about them somehow. So I ignored it and lived in cognitive dissonance because I couldn't explain it with my science. But over time, it became more and more difficult to keep these two parts of my life separate. I accidentally had a spiritual awakening because I was not looking for it, as I was very anti-spiritual, anti-religious. Science was my religion, and science is a bit of a cult. It's difficult to express views that go against the mainstream because you fear you're going to lose your colleagues, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose everyone you know. So I never felt like I needed it, and everything was going well until it wasn't. So I had sort of an existential crisis, because when you have a worldview that tells you that everything is random and meaningless and there is no purpose, then when you start waking up every morning asking the question, why are we here? And there is no answer, it just becomes really difficult. So I started having an existential crisis, and that's when my attention moved from being focused solely on the scientific worldview and my work more towards the familial aspect of that cultural heritage where we incorporate divination and ritual and tradition into our lives. So those two worlds started to collide in this time when I was beginning to crack open and not rely solely on the mainstream scientific materialist worldview. And as that happened, I had a series of coincidences and synchronicities occur in my life that were just difficult to explain statistically. Since I was such a rationalist, logical thinker, and I was trained to be a reductionist through my scientific training, I had a lot of difficulty when I encountered things in my reality that questioned my worldview, and it was not easy to update my beliefs. I had a lot of, oh my gosh, I'm getting emotional. I had a lot of mental anguish and internal struggle and conflict trying to resolve these two different sides. So I started to see meaning in life and the universe and open up to the mystical aspects, but I really resisted and pushed them away at first because I was so tied to my mainstream worldview and my understanding of reality, and of course my scientific training, which was really the core of my identity, what I had worked so hard to build up over all these years. So I really resisted it because for some reason in my head, accepting spirituality or metaphysics or anything that wasn't explained by mainstream science was a betrayal to science and to who I was. And I think made me feel like I wasn't valuable. I started to notice, I would say notice again, because when I was younger, I used to have precognitive dreams, and I was very connected to the flow of life, and I would just know when to email people or just know when something was going to happen, and I became disconnected to that as I grew up, but especially by the time I finished my scientific training, that was totally extinguished. But during this existential crisis and awakening, all of that started to flood it. In a flood just started to come back, and the precognitive dreams came back, knowing when things would happen, feeling other people's emotions, all of it started to pour in. I did not deal with that well. Even though I was rationally trying to open my mind to other worldviews and other models of reality, I think experiencing them started to really unground me. And like I said, I was resisting mentally. And so when it started happening experientially, I resisted a lot. And it just made it difficult. It probably would have gone a lot faster if I had just surrendered, but I resisted. Initially, I didn't dive into the literature. I was just experiencing these things, and I wasn't listening to anything spiritual or focusing on it, but I was listening to a non-spiritual podcast by the comedian Chelsea Handler, and she happened to have a psychic medium on, Lynn Jackson, on just one of the episodes. And Chelsea used to be a skeptic, and so it surprised me that she had a psychic medium on the show. But as Lynn Jackson started to describe the spiritual framework that she believed in, which included karma and soul lessons and reincarnation, that we reincarnate in multiple lives, we choose our lives, we choose lessons for ourselves, it reminded me that in the past, I had seen intuitives or psychics with some of my girlfriends, and they had mentioned the same thing. So I became interested in that. And then during the podcast, they also mentioned a book, Many Lives, Many Masters, by Dr. Brian Weiss, and mentioned it was a psychiatrist case study. Didn't mention that it was past life regression or anything that I would have thought was weird at the time. So I ordered it, and when I read the book, I didn't know what I was reading. I was really surprised that it was quote unquote past life regression, which I didn't know what that was. But I noticed that in the book, he also described the same spiritual framework, that we come back to learn lessons. And it had this whole spiritual overtone that I just wasn't familiar with. But because he was Yale and Columbia educated, a very respectable psychiatrist, I took the book seriously and just got curious and thought I would read more of his work, which led to many other books on past life regression and other healing modalities. And it fascinated me because as a neuroscientist, I know that we have very few options to address mental health concerns, and I know that normal Western medicine has a difficult time addressing chronic ailments, and it seemed that through this literature, they were addressing all kinds of things that we have problems healing in Western culture. So I was really fascinated by that, and of course wondered what the mechanism was and how that could work. So I started interviewing behavioral health practitioners who did past life regression and other scientists as well, mostly because I was interested in getting their perspective and their understanding of what they thought they were doing, and if they thought it was actually healing people, and if they really believed that there was a spiritual dimension to it, or if it was all fantasy, but it helped heal people, so let's just let it happen that way. I wanted to get their perspectives on it. The scientists, on this journey, I started to feel crazy and like I was losing my identity, and wondered if any other scientists were spiritual or religious or believed in anything anomalous. So I decided to start interviewing my colleagues who I'd known for over 10 years because I realized we had never discussed these things together, and I didn't know what they believed, but I was curious. So I started interviewing them, and I found many of them very open. All of us talked about how the true spirit of science is to be curious and open-minded and to follow the evidence, and that if something happens even one time, it's not a data point that you can ignore. And instead, our models need to be updated. So through exploring these topics, through these conversations with my colleagues and with other professionals, it really started to solidify for me that there might be something here. I was really looking for meaning on this journey, I think, which is probably true for a lot of people who find themselves on a spiritual journey. And because I'm a scientist, wanted proof that somebody had found a way to define meaning and then a way to find evidence of it. And through my initial exploration, I found really simple answers that worked for me. So I think in Brian Weiss's work, he talks about the meaning of life is to enjoy all the small moments. So like pouring yourself a cup of coffee or enjoying the way the light pours in the morning, just the little things. And I did realize that I had not been doing that. So that simple psychological reframe actually changed my day-to-day living pretty profoundly immediately. And the little moments started having meaning just in and of themselves. So I started to play with that and I thought, okay, this is one possible definition. If I put it into practice, does it work? And I found that it did. So I also found a lot of conversation in the literature about the relationality of humans and how relationships are so important, and that the people in our lives are the most important things to us in addition to the small moments. And I feel like I had lost sight of that during this crisis. And so when I started incorporating that into my daily living, also just reminders of that, I feel like the quality of my life significantly improved. When I was exploring many different models of reality and of the universe, the holographic universe, when I stumbled across that one made a lot of sense to me. And because when you're coming from a reductionist mindset, and
can you tell that again?
Yeah, sorry. Like reductionist, yeah. When I began exploring many different models of the universe and of reality, the holographic universe really spoke to me because it ties together all the different modalities within spirituality and these areas that we call metaphysics that we have a hard time explaining with reductionist science. So in reductionist science, we separate things and we put them into, we label them, we put them into constructs and separate concepts, so they're separate from each other. But in actuality, that's not how nature is. Everything is interconnected, everything is systems, everything is related. So it doesn't even make sense the way we do science. So something like the idea of a hologram where all the pieces are connected to each other, and it's almost like humans are a microcosm of the macrocosm of the universe, it makes a lot more sense, and it dresses life from a systems perspective. So when one thing is affected, everything else is affected. I mean, that really is how things are in nature and in the universe. Energy and consciousness are really difficult topics in science. And when you're trying to enter this world of bridging science and spirituality, the word energy has such a different meaning for the people in the spiritual space versus the people in the science space, and consciousness as well. So in neuroscience, we define consciousness and study it mostly from the perspective of your waking, everyday, ordinary consciousness. That's what we study, which is like perception, attention, focus. That's what we analyze. And until we can't figure that out, it's really difficult to map the other states of consciousness. So neuroscience focuses on that, and it's the hardest problem in science. We do not have a good definition for consciousness. We don't have a good understanding of how it could emerge from physical matter. There's constant debate, and despite that, we we're still fumbling to find the neural correlates. So we do make the assumption it comes from the brain, that somehow our neurons firing together make this emergent property of consciousness, but even that is up for debate. And I think when you just zoom out of science and come back to the human experience, there's a whole range of conscious experiences that we have: sleeping, dreaming, the state between being awake and being asleep, psychedelic, meditative, trance states. There's a whole range that science doesn't ever look at. And so that's what you start to see in the spiritual side. They're more focused on the whole entire human experience, where science is very focused on just the ordinary waking, everyday consciousness and defining that concept and trying to understand the neural correlates. So there's a huge discrepancy between the two fields about how they talk about these things. Again, energy in science is usually just ATP, like our cells burning what we consider energy. And when you move into the spiritual space, it's a very different definition. They use that word to describe things that we can't measure, that science, mainstream science, doesn't define as energy because it's not on the electromagnetic spectrum. So there's a huge gap there still. Theoretical physicists and cosmologists are still arguing about the exact nature of reality and of the universe. And an idea that's becoming more and more popular is the idea that the universe itself is conscious or has some sort of intelligence behind it. Now, this idea was not taken seriously over the past few decades. It was more of a minimal view, but it's becoming a more and more plausible theory and much wider accepted theory in the field. So it goes back to the idea of the holographic universe. You can't have, if there's intelligence in one piece, there's probably intelligence in all the pieces. They're not separate. So because of that, because of the different fields being bridged together, you're starting to see acceptance of ideas like that, which are very plausible. The implications of the scientific materialist paradigm ignoring spirituality are enormous. And there's multiple reasons why. So from a purely scientific perspective, it means that we are not mapping the entirety of reality. We are only mapping a subsection, which means that all of our models are wrong. And so a lot of our science doesn't explain phenomena well, and we could look at this situation and say, maybe that's why. Maybe it's because we're not including the entirety of human experience. And if we did, we would have a better understanding of reality and we would have more complete explanations. The other implications are humans, like for humanistic, like our experience as humans. Believing that the universe is random and meaningless and has no purpose is not healthy. Even if we took evolutionary theory seriously and agreed that humans developed a propensity to need spirituality or religion as a coping mechanism, then we probably shouldn't destroy that for ourselves if it helped us get to this point. So it's really not healthy for us or helpful. It's actually more harmful to kind of remove that spiritual aspect of our reality. Believing that the universe is random and meaningless really extinguishes the fire and vitality in our souls, the things that we bring as humans to this life experience, the things that ignite us, it extinguishes that. Scientific materialism and mainstream science believe that this is the correct worldview. And we sort of have to move on that assumption for science to work. But And that's why the boundaries stay closed. The field doesn't like to update or expand, and if there's no explanation for something within that worldview, then it's completely excluded. And which is not very helpful to the way that we do science, or to our complete understanding of reality. But it's what the field has decided it needs to move forward. A lot of systems around us seem to be crumbling, and I believe that part of that is because we've moved away from our humanity and our core principles that make us human, which we see in excess on TV and on our movies, but we don't seem to see in reality in our leaders. So a lot of the leaders that lead, different aspects of our society when we're looking at outcomes in each of those fields, there doesn't seem to be any humanity left, or values that serve humanity driving those systems. We've seemed to move into a time where we're extremely disconnected from each other and from nature. And we need to move towards, humans are wired for connection and belonging and community and cooperation, and we need that. We are literally neurologically wired for attachment, love, and connection. And as we move away from that, we tend to not feel safe. We feel threatened. Fear becomes really difficult to suppress. And when an organism is moving from a place of fear, they become dangerous. So we need to kind of address this disconnection that's come about in our society and try to reconnect people in any way possible, really, if that includes smaller communities or smaller events, more connection online. I mean, I don't know the solutions, but there needs to be a move towards more connection, because that addresses this core feeling of not unsafety or not feeling safe that drives people towards fearful behaviors. For the past 100 years, but definitely for the past 50 years, we've been very focused on scientific evidence and relying purely on that. And you see a move towards that in our society, especially with language such as evidence-backed or science-backed, data-driven. But the problem with that is that there's not enough funding. We don't have all of the evidence. So by saying that we're only going to focus on things that are data-driven or science-backed means you're immediately putting everything into a small box of what has been studied and what hasn't. And so because of that, nobody seems to understand how dangerous that is for our society. What we need to do is expand what we accept as evidence, because there are other forms of evidence or knowing, other forms of empirical knowledge, and we need to expand that to include personal experience. And when, from a scientific perspective, especially from a neuroscience perspective, we only have our conscious experience. We only have our subjective experience. That is the only way each of us knows anything, and we can never share it with another person. But if we use discernment and kind of turn inwards towards those states, we can understand them better and start using them as knowledge, just as humans have done for thousands of years in all the wisdom traditions. So we need to start expanding our definition of knowledge, because as great as scientific knowledge is and as useful as it is, it doesn't capture everything. There are qualities that we can't measure with science. There are things we can't reduce to parts. There are systems that, when broken apart and measured in small pieces, don't tell the whole story anymore. So there needs to be a bridging and an expansion of what we consider evidence. And we need to embrace the idea that we don't evolve alone. We are relational creatures. Everything is through relationship, whether it's relationship to ourselves, to others, or to our environment. We are completely interconnected with everything. There's a big difference between old me and new me. Old me was very reductionist, very scientific materialist, very focused on scientific evidence. I was very condescending, arrogant, and I thought I knew everything. And after this journey, I came to understand that I really don't know everything. I don't know most things, and that the world is a lot weirder than we believe that it is in science, and there are a lot of things that we can't measure. And while the scientific method is wonderful, it's extremely limited, and I think really inadequate to address this reality that we live in. So I think I'm just a lot more open now, a lot more loving, a lot more open-hearted, a lot more human. After the spiritual awakening, I found that it was difficult to do just normal science and to stay in the field I was in, which was digital health. So I started my own consulting company. I started working with tech companies that were doing things that were a little more open-minded. And then I also started writing about psychedelics as sort of a public service to spread the findings that were coming out of recent research that showed miraculous mental health healing and improvements in anxiety, depression, and other things. So I also wanted to find other scientists who were open-minded or spiritual or curious about our reality. So a collaborator and I have organized events at our annual neuroscience conference. One of them was neuroscience and spirituality, but we're also looking at events around alternative models of consciousness, just so scientists can get together, especially neuroscientists can get together and explore these ideas about, do we really understand our reality? How can we bridge science and spirituality? How do we feel about consciousness? So creating safe spaces where we can explore these questions together. The psychedelic renaissance is really expanding our understanding of consciousness, because these psychedelic states are called altered states of consciousness. And this is any kind of state of consciousness that is not your normal waking one, right? So it puts you in some other state where a lot of weird things can happen. So what's interesting is that these are starting to happen in scientific contexts. And usually what you see happening, but which cannot happen forever, is the scientists will ignore the weird experiences that the users have, or users or patients. So if somebody goes into a psychedelic state, sometimes they can receive information from somebody who's passed away, or they can receive messages, or they can feel like they have a telepathic connection with a therapist in the room. They can feel other people's emotions, and they can see things that then after the trip come true. So all of these quote unquote paranormal, anomalous, emergent experiences that happen within psychedelics are usually ignored in the scientific context, but they can't ignore them forever. And those are the kinds of experiences that make us question our understanding of consciousness, because in a normal neuroscientific context, in a normal space-time, mainstream science understanding, those types of things should not be possible. It should not be possible for you to have information from another space-time location. It's not possible, but it happens, and they're verifiable, and it's starting to happen more and more because there's more research being done on it. And so it's starting to have scientists question our understanding of not only reality, but consciousness. So psychedelics are really important for that revolution that's starting to happen. I think it will become harder for scientists to continue to dismiss these anomalous or emergent experiences that happen through psychedelics or in general, because it's starting to happen in a scientific context, like within the context of a research designed study. They won't be able to ignore it as easily anymore. The evidence will start to pile up. Having said that, if they don't focus on it and don't measure it, and they never decide to do that, and nobody ever requires that of them, if the funding agencies don't require that of them, if the publications don't, then they could, in theory, ignore it forever. So expanded states of awareness or altered states of consciousness seem to thin the line between the conscious and subconscious brain and open us up for information, regardless of where it comes from, which is debated at the moment, information that heals us. So it appears that from a lot of the literature, that our bodies know how to heal themselves, and all we have to do is get out of the way. So moving into these altered states of consciousness or expanded states of awareness allows your body to have access to that information that it can use to heal itself. Psychedelics are not the only avenue for achieving an altered state of consciousness. Breath work, meditation, there's trance states. There are so many different ways to enter these altered states that are very similar to the effect you get with psychedelics, and they're totally safe and very easy to access. There is a rumor, it's not proven, that Francis Crick had the inspiration or the idea for the double helix structure of DNA while he was on an LSD trip. And the same is true for many other scientists. I think Carrie Mullins, who created the PCR, the polymerase chain reaction technology. I think also was reportedly on an LSD trip, but scientists have over the ages used altered states of consciousness for epiphanies and insights. All the best ones know that that's where true creativity comes from. I definitely feel called to psychedelics and altered states of consciousness and sort of that space between, maybe the liminal space between. And I think it's because it's interesting, the space where rationality meets creativity. And in true science, a lot of scientists know that we do a lot of rational, logical thinking, and then we let it go and go for a walk or take a nap or do a meditation, and then the answer comes to the problem that we're facing, the creativity. So I do feel like there's something in that liminal space that's really interesting, but not only for creativity. What I found through this whole journey is that apparently the answers to healing and interpersonal questions and any sort of problem that arises in your life is in that space. I think the future of medicine will focus on the entire aspect of a human, which is not just chemical. So humans are electrochemical magnetic beings. Every time you have an electrical current, you have a magnetic field. So medicine has been very focused on pharmaceuticals, which are chemical substrates. And because of that, most of the funding has gone there. Pharmaceutical companies have focused there, which is fine and great. But there are other modalities that can improve health and healing in humans that address the other parts of our biological systems, which are electricity and magnetism, anything that's frequency or vibration. All these things are very healing. They just haven't been funded or studied as well. I think sound and light and frequency and sacred geometry and all of these different modalities that have not been examined or incorporated into medicine up to this point, they might be in the future, that there's a place for that, because there does seem to be evidence that they're very healing, and it's just that there hasn't been a lot of funding and research and focus on this aspect to build it out and take it quote unquote mainstream. But there definitely appears to be a space for it in the future. My worldview changes every day and I try to stay open, but I definitely leave a space for the possibility that there is a spiritual and mystical dimension to the universe, or that the universe itself has intelligence, and definitely that there are other intelligences besides humans in the universe. Humanity does seem to be at a major turning point, and I do think a lot of it has to do with us moving away from our true nature of being connected to each other and to the land, and finding comfort in that and safety, and using cooperation instead of competition to build up our societies. So we are definitely moving away from that, and you can only move away from your biological nature for so long before things start to break apart. I think the potential for humanity making an evolutionary leap is there, and I think it just depends how much work we put into ourselves. The more work we put into ourselves, the more we'll see the effects in the environment and in others, since everything is interconnected. To me, love comes back to that core component of being human. It's our need for connection, attachment, and just feeling safe. And what's interesting, that is not a mystery. We know very well that humans as biological systems are wired for connection, attachment, and love. But what's a mystery is why we evolved that way. And if we take evolutionary theory seriously, then we must have evolved that way because it increased our odds of surviving as a species. So, and what does love do for us? It brings us together, it creates supportive systems, it takes out the selfish component of behavior, and humans and other biological organisms seem to work more powerfully in groups together. They're safer, so they're more able to survive. So to me, that's what I think of when I think of love, which may not be very romantic or poetic, but it does speak to a core feature of humanity and why we feel that way, why we're driven towards it or drawn towards it, and how it binds us together.